Arizona spent 2 decades releasing roughly 200 California condors into empty skies above the Grand Canyon. On paper, it is one of North America's greatest conservation victories. But when biologists pull blood from those birds, the vast majority test positive for the same lead poisoning that nearly erased the species. What came back was not a rescued population, and understanding why begins with the moment only 22 remained. By 1982, the California condor, a bird that had soared over North America since the Pleistocene, outlasting the mammoth and the saber-toothed cat, had been reduced to just 22 individuals in the wild. An ancient survivor of the Ice Age was suddenly on the verge of total extinction. This modern collapse was driven entirely by human activity. While roads fragmented ancestral habitat and power lines sliced through flight paths, an invisible toxin contaminated the food supply. Scavenging condors ingested spent lead bullet fragments embedded in the carcasses and gut piles left behind by hunters. Modern veterinary necropsies confirmed that lead poisoning caused more than half of all documented condor deaths in the wild, turning their natural feeding behavior into a lethal cycle. By 1987, wildlife managers faced a stark calculation. Leaving the remaining birds in the wild meant certain extinction. The federal recovery program had to shift from habitat preservation to an absolute rescue mission. On April 19, 1987, at 10:15 a.m., biologists at Bitter Creek National Wildlife Refuge captured the last free-flying condor, a 7-year-old male designated AC-9. His removal brought the wild population to 0. A C-9 joined 26 other condors already held in captivity, split evenly with 13 at the San Diego Wild Animal Park and 13 at the Los Angeles Zoo. For the first time in history, a species that had ruled the skies for millennia existed only behind cage bars, initiating a high-stakes emergency breeding operation to rescue the dying lineage. On December 12, 1996, the recovery program transitioned from captive isolation to the open skies of northern Arizona. At Vermilion Cliffs National Monument, biologists prepared to open the gates of a remote cliffside release pen. 6 captive-bred juvenile condors, flown from a propagation facility in Boise, Idaho, stood as the inaugural cohort. This high desert terrain, characterized by sheer red sandstone cliffs and powerful thermal updrafts, was selected as the first proving ground for a southwest return. The Peregrine Fund assumed lead management of this field operation, establishing a direct working partnership with the Bureau of Land Management and state wildlife agencies to coordinate the release. Releasing only 6 birds was a highly controlled, cautious trial. It was an active experiment designed to analyze whether captive reared juveniles could successfully forage, find safe roosts, and navigate a vast, unfamiliar environment without wild-born mentors. The success of the entire Southwest reintroduction rested on how these few pioneers adapted to the wild. As these first 6 condors took flight over the Arizona Strip, the recovery effort moved out of the laboratory and directly into the wild. The December 1996 release of 6 birds initiated a sustained 20-year reintroduction campaign. Over the next 2 decades, the Peregrine Fund and its state and federal partners systematically released roughly 200 captive-bred condors into the Arizona skies, transforming a localized trial into a regional wildlife recovery effort. Released cohorts learned to forage and nest in the high desert environment, eventually establishing a free-flying population of more than 100 birds. This resident population now ranges far past the Vermilion Cliffs, utilizing the sheer walls of the Grand Canyon and extending northward into the rugged canyon country of southern Utah. Each September, during National Public Lands Day, biologists open the cliffside pens to release a new cohort of juvenile condors before a public crowd. These annual first flights provide a highly visible measure of the program's progress. On paper, the cumulative data indicates an extraordinary biological recovery. By the end of 2025, the global condor population reached 559 individuals, with 341 flying free in the wild. Arizona alone hosted 125 of these wild birds, cementing the region as a primary stronghold for the species. This growing flock represents a massive logistical achievement. Decades of intensive captive breeding and coordinated releases have successfully repopulated empty desert skies with North America's largest flighted bird. Yet, this numerical growth also introduces a complex dilemma. Behind the rising population curves lies an unresolved tension. Whether a population that remains dependent on a continuous pipeline of captive breeding and active field management can ever achieve true, long-term ecological independence. To field biologists, the concept of a self-sustaining wild population has a precise ecological definition. It describes a species capable of surviving, reproducing, and maintaining its numbers over generations without continuous human assistance. For the California condor, that threshold remains out of reach. Behind the encouraging counts of birds soaring over the Grand Canyon is a stark biological reality. The wild population is currently structured as an open-ended, highly intensive medical intervention. Every year, field teams coordinate exhaustive health assessments in remote canyon landscapes. Biologists recapture free-flying condors to perform routine, hands-on physical exams, check for physical trauma, and draw blood for testing. The results of these surveillance checks are uniform and deeply troubling. Systemic chronic lead exposure affects almost every individual in the population over its lifetime, demanding immediate medical treatment when levels spike. The toxin enters their bodies through the exact same pathway that triggered the species' collapse decades ago. As scavengers, condors feed on carcasses and gut piles left in the field. When those animals are harvested with lead ammunition, microscopic fragments of the heavy metal scatter throughout the tissue. A condor ingesting even a tiny shard of this material absorbs a dose that paralyzes its digestive system, leading to starvation. Without constant veterinary intervention, including emergency field capture, clinical hospitalization, and weeks of chemical chelation therapy to strip lead from their blood, the mortality rate would quickly outpace the birth rate. This labor-intensive medical loop requires field biologists to physically wrestle, transport, and monitor these giant birds. Handlers routinely describe the physical scars on their hands from managing the massive, defensive raptors during weeks of intensive care. Under current conditions, wild survival remains a highly manufactured success rather than a natural, self-sustaining equilibrium, sustained only by a permanent loop of intensive human management. If hands-on medical intervention is merely a temporary shield, systemic policy is the only permanent solution. The clearest proof of concept occurred on July 1st, 2019, when California implemented a complete statewide ban on lead ammunition for all hunting. Following the ban, agency monitoring recorded a major shift. The proportion of free-flying condors with clinically toxic blood lead levels fell from 18% down to 8%, a 55% reduction. A parallel U.S. Geological Survey analysis tracked a 57% drop in actual lead-related deaths. This evidence suggests that legislative reform, rather than endless captive breeding, is the primary driver of long-term survival. To measure real progress, biologists rely on a strict ecological standard, the federal benchmark of 90% survival to age 5 by the year 2030. Reaching this target requires moving from reactive emergency treatment to early prevention. Field teams now deploy early rapid blood testing as a diagnostic warning system, catching toxic exposure in the field before it becomes fatal. Yet because neighboring states like Arizona continue to rely on voluntary programs rather than mandatory bans, the threat remains highly regionalized. This patchwork of regulations, combined with supply shortages of non-lead alternatives, means birds flying across state boundaries remain highly vulnerable. The ultimate question is no longer whether human ingenuity can breed enough birds to stock the skies, but whether public policy can ever transform intensive clinical management into true, independent recovery. Today, the condor flies free, yet survives on life support. Without a systemic shift away from lead ammunition, this predator remains a ward of intensive human care. We must ask, are we truly restoring a wild species or simply maintaining an outdoor exhibit? Share your perspective below.